I obviously don't look much like my photo anymore because things has changed and hairdressers are very hard to come by these days. So I'm a senior developer advocate. I work for Rubrik, and a big part of my work is automating, scripting, and working with APIs in general. And that's also how I connected this to Power Automate and the Graph API. So what kind of challenges did I personally run into when using the Graph when using Power Automate? So one of the things that I wanted to do is whenever I'm working with Office 365 or the entire Microsoft 365 suite is the fact that there are a lot of connectors that make it easier to get information. But sometimes not all of the information is available and can be directly queried using those connectors. So in order to work around that, I also started using the Graph API and to discover what kind of options we have available and how we can get more out of Power Automate. And in a sense, this kind of goes against the idea of Power Automate, where everything is very simple with connectors. But once you want additional properties, or you want to know more about whatever kind of object you are working with, it can be quite useful to at least have the building blocks to get to the point that you can query the data and get what you need out of Power Automate. So with that out of the way, I'll be covering a couple of things in this session. And it's not going to be death by PowerPoint, I hope, fortunately. So I'll just briefly go over a couple of concepts. So I'll talk about APIs. So I'll give a bit of a background of what they are and how they work in a general sense. Then I'll go over the connectors. And then we'll directly dive into demos in which I'll show how we can use some of the Graph API calls to extend what we can do in Power Automate. And at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. And in the meantime, I can't see the chat right now, but I'll occasionally take a look and see what pops up there. Cool. With that out of the way, let's start talking about connectors. So the connectors in Power Automate, as many as you know, of you already know, are the way that we can interact with all kinds of different services. The ones I'll be focusing on during this session are going to be the Office 365 connectors, and there are, of course, a lot of third-party ones available as well to connect to any kind of service. But the Office 365 ones are the ones I work the most with. One of the things that I found challenging when getting started is the fact that there's so many versions out there. So obviously, I went for the approach of, okay, well then. Whichever is the highest version number is going to be the most complete or the most functional connector out there. But quite quickly, I started running into issues where I couldn't find all the information that I wanted. So one of the things that I thought was relatively simple was to get the attachments that are attached to an event. And a couple of Google searches or Bing searches later, I figured out that the event connector was actually not able to get that. So that's how I started my journey towards Graph API and what we could do with those. So we can see that most of the connectors have many different versions, but if you're not willing to put in a feature request to get whatever kind of property you would like to have in the connector to be included, then the only other alternative is to start looking at a way you can build it yourself. And in my opinion, the Graph API is the most flexible tool we have at our disposal. But before we go into that, I want to set the stage and talk about what APIs are and give a bit of bit of a technical background of how APIs work and what we use them for and why they are so awesome. Yeah, before I get into the real technical part, one of the things that I might be a bit of an odd one. One of the things that I like to do is actually to use. I have a lot of home automation in my apartment, and some of the stuff that I bought, I wasn't exactly sure of how I could. How I could automate beyond whatever kind of app was supplied with, for example, the lamps that I bought. So my approach was to actually sniff the network and take a look at what kind of API calls are going on my network and see if they're encrypted, and if they're not encrypted and I can actually understand them, then I would use those APIs to automate to turn on and turn off my lamps, for example. So that is one of the cases in which APIs actually directly influence what I do in my daily life. So with that out of the way, what are APIs? So aside from the technical term application programming interface, which doesn't tell us a whole lot, it is an API endpoint is hosted on any kind of web server, and a web server here is displayed as this big server. But as I just mentioned, web servers nowadays can be inside your lamp or inside any kind of appliance. So the way it works is whenever there are a number of API endpoints available, and that endpoint always expects a certain kind of input. So with web requests, we have requests like GET and like POST. Those are the most common ones, also when working with the Graph API. And whenever you send a request, you get a response back. And there's a couple of possible responses. The one we always hope for is to get back a 200 or something in the 200 series. If you get a 400 back, then you probably typed in the wrong API endpoint, so it can't find the endpoint. And if it's a 500, then either you gave the incorrect input, or something crashed on the server and it couldn't complete your request. So the advantage of it is, and I won't go by it step by step, is the design of server and client are independent. So the fact that you have those you have those endpoints available, as long as the structure, the input structure and the output structure stay the same. It doesn't matter what kind of code is actually generating this. And by doing so, by having this standardized interface, you have a lot of flexibility of accessing this, because if you want to do an API call, it doesn't matter if you're on Linux, or if you're on Windows, or if you're using Power Automate, for example. Web calls are always the same, and you can invoke them from any kind of platform. And the nice thing is that you can choose to improve an individual endpoint without having to change your entire product. So you can, if you're the person managing the APIs, then you can update some code on the server side to increase the efficiency and to be able to handle bigger workloads. So there's advantages both from the user side as well as from the person that is maintaining or hosting the API. Note that I'm talking about REST APIs. There's different protocols out there. REST or RESTful endpoints are the ones that are also used for the Graph API. There's also a new-ish upcoming one called GraphQL, which was designed by Facebook, but I'll leave it at that it exists, and that is pretty awesome, but we don't have it available for the Graph API, so we can forget about that. So I believe we talked about the fact that there's requests. What I didn't go into yet is that there's two different kinds of requests. So when you do a GET request, what you do is you put the entire query, you put it inside your URL. So if you want to have some information about user A, you would talk to the user's endpoint. You would put either the identifier or the UPN of the user, and then you would get the response back. You can also work with post requests or different requests that support a body. And when you're using those requests, you provide, in most cases, a JSON payload in which you specify what kind of information you want or what kind of action you want the server or the endpoint to take. So that is a 5-minute introduction into what APIs are, just to give a bit of background and to also have some understanding of what we're going to dive into. So before I move on, let me quickly open up Teams, see if there's any questions, and otherwise I'll just keep trucking away. Here we go. Let's see. Cool. Yep, no questions yet. So with that, we're going to go into what we can do with Power Automate and the Graph API. So that means no more slides for now, at least, and we're going to do more demos. Cool. So first things first. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how to set up an app registration. Jan in the previous session already gave a quick look, but I'll still take you through this step by step just to know how this goes. Note that normally you don't want to share all these IDs, but since this is my test environment, I don't really care because I'll spin it all down. Yes, so let's go to app registration. So starting from the top, we need to give this a name. So whatever kind of name we want to give this, since we won't be using this one, test graph API app. So we don't need to specify this URI. Then the two important ones that we want to use inside Power Automate are going to be the client ID, application or client ID, and the tenant. So those are the two that we want. So the next step of what you want to do is you'll need to determine what kind of API permissions you need. And the way we're going to take a look at that is to the Graph API Explorer. But for now, we can take a look to see what kind of permissions we can add. So you notice that the Graph API is already listed front and center. So if you take a look at what we have here, let me make it a little bit bigger. We can see that there's a whole lot of sessions available. So if, for example, we would like to get some information about the mailbox settings of users in this organization, I can click this one. Let's go a bit further. So, and for example, we would also want to be able to read all user profiles. So if we do this, we can add the permissions. The next step we want to do is we want to consent that this can be used in my environment. So since I'm the admin, I can do this. And you can see we get the green check marks. So that makes us all very happy. So now we're at the stage that we can almost start using this. The last thing we need to do is, yes, I can zoom in more. How's this, Vangelis? Just give me a thumbs up if this is the right zoom level, then I know we can keep on going. Cool. So next thing we need is we need to have a secret. So the way we do this, we define a client secret. I always put it to expire, because then if I forget that this client secret existed, then in 1 year I'll have some troubleshooting to do to see why my secret isn't working anymore. Yes, so new secret. So generating this, one thing to keep in mind is that this value that we can see here, the actual secret, we can only copy paste this now, because if we go away from this page and then we go back, then it can disappear. So with that, we now have a Graph API app. So we can use this to do the following things. We can read stuff about mailbox, and we can read user profiles. Since we won't be actually using this app, this was just to demo how we can set this up. We can now get rid of this app again, but I'll leave that for later. So then the next step is, and this will lead into the first Power Automate demo. So what we're going to do is we're going to find out how we can get some mailbox settings of a user. So the way I always get started with the Graph API is to go to the documentation. I just go for the full reference. So just typing mailbox, we can see mailbox settings. And this is where you can discover what you can do. So it tells you can either get or update. Since I just want to get some information, you can see all the different requests, and I'll zoom in again. We can see that there's all different requests possible here. So the first one and the easiest one is to just query for yourself. So we'll do that here just to see what kind of output we can get. And this output is also what we'll be using later in Power Automate to be able to parse the data that we get out of the Graph API. So we can see we get a lot of information here. With that, we're going to switch over to Power Automate, and we're going to take a look at an approval workflow. So what I've created here is a simple approval workflow. So we have a form. The form is we're going to request a new laptop. And whenever a user requests a new laptop, they can select how many screens they want, how much memory they want, and where they want it shipped. So obviously this is a dot. It doesn't actually ship the laptops, but just to have a demo form here. So if this one gets submitted, it will then kick off this flow, and the flow will do a couple of things. So it will read from the form, gets the response details, it gets the user profile, so we get that by the responder email. Then we get the manager, we create an approval, we put some text in there, and then we wait for the approval to complete. And then normally the next step would be to either put it in whatever kind of purchasing system, or send an email to the IT department or whatever. But for the purpose of this demo, I just left it at the approval stage. So let's see if this actually works. We go to this, we do submit, and then we should start. We should see the flow running. And I already get a notification over here. So the notification is there's an approval. So let's take a look at that one in Power Automate. So if I go to action items, approvals, so this is the administrative account, we can see that 21 seconds ago, there is a request. So if you take a look at this request, we can see all the details are here. This is also emailed to me on my to my mailbox, so I can either do it in Power Automate or I can do it from email. It will have the same results. But this also brings us to the downside of having a workflow like this, because if I choose to not do anything with this, it will forever be stuck. So unless I manually go into here and cancel this flow will forever stay running. And for now, we're going to leave it in this state. So what is a potential way that we can work around this? So for now, I'll disable this flow because I don't want multiple flows to trigger. And we're going to go on to the next one. So what we can also do is we can put in a timeout, because one of the features in Power Automate is that we can have simultaneous actions. So then what we can do, we pretty much have the same flow. We create the approval, but then at the same time, while it's waiting for the approval, I've also put a timer here. And in this case, I set the timer for 10 seconds. And after 10 seconds, I will remove the approval. And in this case, I will afterwards terminate the flow because there was no approval. But what you could also do is you could go over to another approver to get this request sent over to a different team or the manager of the manager. So let's take a look at how this one will work. Let's see if I actually turned it on, because I tend to forget that. Yes, it's turned on. So I'll submit another response. I'll go for the 7 screens, 128 GB. And actually, as a side note, the 7-screen laptop actually exists. This picture that we can barely see on the background is actually a 7-screen laptop, which was recently announced. It's completely ridiculous, but I thought it was fun. So request submitted. We'll give it a moment. So we can see if we switch back over here, get another approval from 8 seconds ago. And press it again, we can see the approval has already disappeared. So what happened here? If we go into this in the run history of this flow, you can see it failed. Well, it didn't technically fail. I told it to stop, but what we did, we waited for 10 seconds. In normal environments, we could just say like, oh, if after 2 or 3 days we haven't received a response, then forward it on to another approver, or from the start just have multiple approvers in there. But the benefit we have here is that we also remove the approval. So instead of cluttering the inbox of whoever got the approval in there, it gets removed and we can move on to the next step. The next step in this case is termination, because I'm still not completely satisfied with this solution, because what we run into here is automation is supposed to make our life easier, and it's supposed to give us a way to do things faster. And if we're going to have a process that's just going to wait X amount of days before taking the next step, then we're not fully using the technology that we have at our disposal. So what other things can we come up with? And this is where we get into how we can augment what we do using the Graph API. So we'll go out of this one. Yeah, before I do that, just a quick one. I forgot to highlight that. So what we're doing here, how we remove the approval, because I didn't show that one yet. So what we do here is we have a, so the wait is just a simple time calculation. So if we tap that one, I just use the add seconds function. So add 10 seconds, but if you want to do it with days, for example, you can do add days and make it 3 days, for example. So that was this function, and what we have here is I look for the approval ID. So that's the one that we get out of the approval checkbox, the approval action, I mean. And then we set it to complete, just to get it out of the queue of whoever was approving it. Cool. We don't save this. We turn this off. And we go over to the third one. And this is where we start getting into the Graph API. So what we have here is we're now using the client ID, the tenant ID, the secret to build out a Graph API call. 2 other things I do: I set a requester to a variable, and I set approver to be empty. And the reason I do that is because I have a do while loop here. The idea behind this loop is determine manager to approve is to have an automatic process take a look at whichever manager is not going to be out of office, because this is something that we can programmatically determine if the manager of the requester is out of office, and if that manager would be out of office, then we would get the manager of the manager, and then escalating until we're at the CEO. Or if the CEO is also out of office, we would be in a situation where we can't find we can't find a manager anymore. But this is something that we could account for in here as well. So the get manager block is still the same. The Graph API call that we're doing here is the one that I was showing before as well. So we use this one, and we're going to go to the specific endpoint, which is automatic reply setting. We could also go for mailbox settings, but the way I view it is I always want to get back as little information as possible, just the relevant information, because then the calls are smaller and more efficient. It's it's not really a consideration for Power Automate, because it doesn't really matter how big the requests are or how long they take. And then the other options, so we have the tenant ID and the client ID and the secret in here. Those are the important ones, and then setting authentication to AD. The second step is to go into parsing the out of office. So we can see that we have this block here, and I've already created this one. But to give you an idea of how we can generate this, so the input for this parse JSON block is the body we get back from this HTTP request, and the schema here I just automatically generated this one. You can either get it from the documentation, or you can take the output from the Graph Explorer, which I'll show you now. So I showed this query. So I'm running this with my administrative account, not with a demo user account. So here we can see I get all my mailbox settings. And copy paste this one. And if we run it like this, we can see we only get the relevant information about automatic replies. And the automatic reply setting is the out of office setting. So we can now see that the status is disabled. And we can see that this field is also called status. So I'm just going to take the entire output we have here. I'm going to get rid of this. And then what we want to do is we want to go to generate from sample. We go in here, put a JSON payload here, and we can see that it fills it out with all the information. One of the things to keep in mind that occasionally what happens is when you automatically generate something like this, not all the values are that are in Office 365 or in Azure AD are mandatory. So if you're ever going to run into an example where you get an error message where it says expected a string but got back null, what you can do for this specific type, you can actually specify more than just string. So in this case, what you could do is you could adapt this and change this to accept both string and null. So that is something to keep in mind if you use the generated output from the Graph API. In this case, it wouldn't trigger. And now that we have this information, we've parsed it. We now get the benefit of being able to take the different properties that we get out of this API call. So there's a couple of things we can check for. The one I chose is to check the status. If you want to make it fancier, what you could do is you could go for the scheduled start date time and the scheduled end date time, and to see if, for example, the scheduled end date time is going to be less than 10 minutes, then you could still take this object. So it gives you a lot of flexibility because there's so many fields to choose from. So if it's not equal to always enabled, so then it would trigger this one. It would set the manager as the approver. If that is not the case, what we can do is we can we could set this to change the value of requester, and then it would start over this loop, and it would get the manager of what used to be the manager, and it would go to this again, find out if the manager of the manager is, if that's again not the case, get a manager of the manager, and that way you can keep on looping. You probably want to put an exception in there that if there's no more managers, that either the flow fails or that you set it to some kind of default group. But in my test environment, I have I know who is out of Office and who isn't. So okay, with that out of the way, let's just fire this one up and see what it does. The next steps are the same as the previous one. Let's see if I turned it on. Yes, turned on. So then I'll do another request, go for 7 screens again, send it to Buckingham Palace. And we'll see if this one runs as expected. So I get a notification, so I know that the approval came in. So if I refresh this one, it's here 17 seconds ago. That's fantastic. But now to see if this actually works, we'll set our out of office, automatic replies, and we now turn this on. So it's now turned on. We can see here we're back in the Graph Explorer. We'll run the same request again against what is the manager of this user, which is the admin. And we can see that the status is now set to always enabled. So this is exactly what we're checking against in the flow. What we're going to do is we're going to go to this form again, and we'll just execute this one again. So we can now see that it goes to this, and we should now see a different result here. see if we already went through there. Yes. So we can take a look at what kind of information happened here. And here we see that status is always enabled. It parsed this, and the condition went to set approver to department lead. In this case, the department lead, I have 2 users, so I set it to myself. So now I can approve my own laptop request. But this is just to give you an idea of what kind of information we can get out of the Graph API. So moving on, what other things can we get out of there? So we'll jump back into the Graph Explorer. And in this case, what we're going to take a look at is we're going to look at what we can do with calendars and events. We'll run this against my calendar. So we can see that we go for calendar, then we just get back to default calendar. And we can take the ID of this calendar. We'll put it in the request. So we go into calendars, and then we can go into events. Cool. So now we can see that we actually get the events back in my calendar. And the first thing that you see here is that if we take a look at the amount of properties we have available when we're using the Graph API, and I'll contrast that to what we have in the calendar flow. So we do here, so we have get events, and I'll add an action just to take a look at what kind of information we have. So I'll variable test and make this a string, just so we can see the dynamic variables we have available. So what we have here, subject, end time, and a bunch of properties. You can see this is about, I'd say about 20, 25 properties. But if you look in the Graph API output, then we can see that we have significantly more and a lot of nested properties. The one I'm mostly interested in is this is also comes from an issue that I ran into, is that some users were accidentally removing calendar items, removing attached items from calendar events from there, and then they wouldn't be able to find it back. Obviously, storing important documents in calendar invites is probably not the best idea, but in order to account for this, I turn to the Graph API endpoint, and with that, I'm going to show a different way of querying as well. So the one I'm looking for is, I'll just do a search. So has attachments. So what we can do is, aside from the query we have now, and let me pull up Notepad so we can actually see the full path. So we can see we have a pretty long query here. Let me increase the font a little bit. We've zoom in. So we have a pretty long query here, but what we can also do is, and this is independent of the endpoint, we can do a bit of filtering in here. So if, for example, we only want to get back one result, we can do top one. Let me make sure. And the one that I'm looking for now is, let's see, has attachment. So now if we can take a look here, we see that by putting this one, that indicates that we're looking for additional that we extend the query. So in this case, we can just specify has attachment because we want it when attachment is specified to true. You can see that an event with test attachments comes up, which I specifically created for this purpose. Then if we take a look at the attachments themselves, then we can see that that if we actually want to get to these attachments, we can't find them here yet. So we need to dive one part further. So let's turn to here and let's take a look at attachments. And then we want attachments from calendar. So if we want to get attachments, then you can see that the endpoint we're looking for. So it always specifies either the me endpoint or users/ID or UPN, whatever you prefer. So the correct path is either calendar events ID attachments, or if we're looking for a specific calendar. So what it means with the ID for the calendar here, and that is one that still occasionally trips me up because they have calendar and calendars. So from a naming convention point of view, I always try to avoid that with API endpoints because it's very easy to miss the S and then don't understand why the request is failing. And I totally did not run into that multiple times. So we have this request here. We want to do it for other users. So let me get this one into Notepad as well. So we can get it up to this in there. So then we are. So the last ID that we want is to have the ID of the event, and we'll take a look at what kind of information we get back if we enter that in there. So we can just find the ID here, and we'll put it in here as well. So we end up with a very big URL. So that in here, and the query. So now what we can see is we get a couple of things. So we get the name of the attachment. So in this case, it's an MP3. And we get the content bytes. So this is going to be quite a long query. And that keeps on going for a while. Let's see. And we can see that we have another smaller one, so just an XML file. And these are both encoded. So encoded, not encrypted. So this is something that's very easy to convert back into a file because this is just base64, and base64 is a way to encode any kind of binary file into something that you can pass over the web, so pass over an API endpoint. Cool. So if we want to, if we would want to reconstruct these files, or if we would want to save attachments of certain events to disk, for example, if you have users that quite often delete their files, you can use this endpoint. You can put this into your flow, and by doing so, you have a way to pull this out of the calendar events and onto your OneDrive or onto into SharePoint, or a more sensible way to store attachments. So one of the things that I'd like to point out here is the reason you can we can get this information out of everyone's calendar was what we did here in the app registration. So if I go back into the test graph API and we go over those permissions, we can see that here we have user read and read all. But if we want to be able to get this calendar information, we go for application, we go for calendars. And if we just want to get the information out of there, we go for read. But if we want to be in a position where someone has removed one of their documents from their calendar invites, or even worse, they've removed their entire calendar invites or all their calendar items, having read write can be useful for restore purposes. Because what this gives you is a way to not only get the information out of the calendars of every user in your organization, or however you scope this permission, but it also allows you to restore this. So what you can do is you can build a small backup and restore workflow using Power Automate, where you can take items that would normally be very hard to export, because the only other way would be to instruct users to make regular backups to their calendar and export that to a shared drive or something like this. But that would rely on the end users, and by using the Graph API in combination with Power Automate, you would be able to get all the information out there, and the moment they remove something, you could either email it back or you could just place it back in their calendar like magic. And when we talk about listing attachments, I mentioned that we can put the information back as well. So that is over here, add attachment. So then we can see that when we were in list attachments, we can see that we were doing a GET request. So in GET in general with REST endpoints. In general with REST endpoints, whenever you do a GET, it's going to be a non-destructive operation. So it's quite safe to experiment with those. If you're going to work with POST requests, just make sure that you're hitting the correct user. Although there is some protection here that by the fact that using the fact that all these IDs are in here, and because of those IDs, it becomes hard to delete or add things to the wrong user. So to take a look at what one of these requests would look like. One of the things it mentions that when we're doing a POST request, we need to attach a body. So an example of that is this one. And what we're going to do is we're going to do this one from the Graph API to show how we can add this. So we go here, we change get to post. We have the correct endpoint. Yep. And then we put this in the body. And let's run this. Let's see if we still have the correct. Okay. Well, in that case, I'm going to leave this one as the bug as it is, because the idea was that this would add this file, but I am kind of I don't really know why it failed here. Let's switch back to Power Automate and to see how we can add calendar specific things in there. We still follow the same kind of workflow. So in this case, I'm doing it for a single user. So the single user is my demo user 1 that we've been working with the entire session. And we're going to list the specific events for the entire calendar. And what we do here is we also get events from the calendar. There's a couple in here. So if the UK holidays, the calendar, and the birthdays, we just want the calendar. And what we do is we're going to get a couple of subjects and IDs there. One thing I need to do here is make sure that this is going to be a unique name. So we'll add in the event subject. So with that, we're going to save this. And this is my lazy way of quickly starting a flow. You can see this one is running. It's already completed. So what we've done, we get the events in the calendar, and we're going to get a couple of IDs and guide those to OneDrive. So if you go to OneDrive, you can see events, and we have, oh, that's not the one I was looking for. So we have, we covered this event, for example, and you can see we've gotten the title and the ID of this event here. So if we want more information about this request and we want to integrate this into Power Automate, then go back in here. We'll update this flow and going for events, we're going for this specific ID of the event and going to take this one out of here. Oh, take this out of here. Graph event.log. The content of the file is going to be the body of get calendar. And we can get rid of this as well and get it out. And we'll save this one. And then we'll run the test. We go automatically recently used trigger. There's not much to the trigger, so we can just run this. In the meantime, we go to OneDrive, so we can actually see the output. Then we have graph event. And then we can see we have the information returned to us as one big JSON object. But if you would open this up in VS Code, you can get this in a nice readable format. So that's how you can do some basic extensions with the calendar. You could also opt for getting all calendar items here or getting all attachment out of there. It just depends on your end goal and what you're trying to achieve. So with that one out of the way, I see that I have 6 minutes left, so I'm going to switch over to some time. And that also lists my preferred contact details. So I can see that Savar already asked a question in the chat a couple minutes ago. So where am I sending the secret while accessing the endpoints of Graph API? So let me show you what we're doing there. So if you go to run history, and we back out of this one, we go for edit. So we can actually see where this gets sent by taking a look at the advanced options. So you send it to whatever logon authority you have, and there's support for about 10 of them, I think. But in this case, I just send it to Azure AD because my test environment doesn't have a specific provider. So you send the secret to Azure, to Microsoft, the default authentication. I do want to mention and stress that Jan Bakker in the previous session made a very good comment. You never want to keep this kind of information in your flows. You want to keep this in key vault. But for demo purposes, it's easier to show. It's easier to show it like this and to give you an idea of what happens without further complicating things. Back to the llama. Does anyone else have any questions or?
Thank you, Job, for that. So what you've done today is really uncover the nuts and bolts to how to develop with the Office 365 with Power Automate. So you really helped us to understand the API a lot better and the tooling, and how to leverage that with Flow. So that was really, really useful, Job. As you know, Job, a lot of us come from different backgrounds. We come from SharePoint, Dynamics, but it's Office 365 and Graph, which really is the central point for, especially for user interaction. And what you've done today is you've helped us to have better clarity on how to develop on the Microsoft 365 platform with the Graph API and its tool set. What I'd like to ask you, Jop, is do you have any kind of final comments, suggestions to the community for those who are maybe new to Microsoft 365 and Graph API, and getting them I say more familiar as in respect to development?
I think the easiest way to get started is that's what I try to show as well, is go into the reference documentation and just type what you think you want. And if you keep it to one word, you get all the options of where you can find it. And that will explain, will teach you more about how to work with those specific endpoints. But the easiest way is to just leverage the power of the Power Automate, the Power Apps community, and look at the various blog posts. Go into the Microsoft Tech community. I'm a big tweeter. The Twitter, ask questions on Twitter. Just engage with the larger community, because most of the things that you want to do, someone else has most likely already done. It can be a good learning exercise, but leveraging the power of the community when you just want to get something done would be the biggest takeaway, because we have an awesome community here.
Okay, so I've shared your Twitter. Since you've confessed to being a tweeter, we have shared your Twitter connections for everyone to connect with you. Any other connections that we should share so that the community can keep in touch with you apart from Twitter?
Well, you've shared my LinkedIn at the start of the session. My GitHub is also relatively simple, just my name without the underscore. I'll share that one there, and I'll post a repository in which I'll post my slides and all the code that I used in the session, so you can get started with the flows that I showed. And I always find it an easy start point to start off with something that's already there and then modify it to your own purpose.